Welcome to AI Australia, brought to you by eliiza. On this show, your hosts James Wilson and Nigel Dalton have in-depth conversations with technology leaders, academics, and AI professionals about all things artificial intelligence. We'll explore a broad range of topics, including AI strategy, technology, and ethics, providing valuable insights for Australian businesses at all stages of AI adoption. And now, your hosts, James and Nigel.
All right, g'day everybody. Welcome to AI Australia. This is your host, James. Nigel's taken a well-deserved break today, and I'm really excited to introduce my stand-in co-host for the day, a guy called Craig Templeton, who's Chief Information Security Officer for REA Group. And our topic today is all about security and with security and cybersecurity and some of the big kind of trends in this space related to AI and ML. So really happy to have Craig on the show. We've got a wonderful guest joining us as well, who we'll introduce shortly. But first of all, Craig, do you want to just share a bit about your background with our audience?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, James. Really great to be here. So I've been in technology, I guess, for about 25 years, but probably about the last 20 years in security. I kind of fell into it when I worked at IBM, but don't hold that against me. Actually, IBM was quite a cool place to kind of get introduced to security. At the time, it was called compliance, and it was something that nobody wanted to do. And I thought, nobody wants to do that. Maybe I'll give that a go. And it was one of those things that wasn't currently being offshored somewhere else. And I thought, well, security might be a thing in the future. So that's kind of how I fell into it. Been in a whole bunch of roles since then. Came to Australia from Ireland almost 10 years ago. And spent a lot of time in financial services. So I've seen a broad spectrum of sort of cyber threats and the evolution of security as well. And now here I am at REA Group, living it out in the digital cloud. So it's been a cool journey.
Awesome. Well, it's really good to have you on the show, mate. I'm really looking forward to you helping me navigate this topic. So, and we've got a wonderful guest who's joining us from the US. Zane Lackey is the co-founder and chief security officer at a business called Signal Sciences. He's also the author of Building a Modern Security Program, which is published under O'Reilly Media, and he serves on multiple public-private advisory boards. And prior to Signal Sciences, Zane led a security team at Etsy. And was really at the forefront. Etsy, one of the real pioneers of security and DevOps and cloud. So brings a huge amount to the conversation today. So Zane, welcome to the show and thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm super excited for the conversation and looking forward to it.
And Zane, you've had a pretty phenomenal career. I mean, I think the version that I just read out is the abridged highlights, to be fair. So maybe you can share with our audience a bit about kind of how your career's unfolded and the path you've taken to get where you are today.
Sure. Well, I don't know about phenomenal, but I've certainly had plenty of excitement throughout my career. Going back, I started out in security consulting and pen testing for folks that knew ISEC Partners, or which later became NCC Group. And I was incredibly fortunate to be there when I was. I was actually the first employee back at ISEC way back when, and just worked with folks that were absolutely incredible, and that I learned so much from during my time there, and that a bunch of those folks have gone on to just really incredible roles and places in the industry. And then after about 6 years there, I got given this really interesting opportunity, which was to go be the first CISO at Etsy, where this was, I think, close to 9 years ago now. And it was, at the time, it was a few folks knew Etsy as the consumer brand. What most folks outside of kind of the leading edge engineering world didn't know at the time was that it was Etsy on the East Coast of the US and Netflix on the West Coast of the US that were really pioneering what we now call DevOps and cloud. And so I got to be one of the first CISOs to go through that shift, which was, in retrospect, incredibly exciting. At the time, certainly felt fairly painful most days because we just had to, experiment with new ways to try security in that world. I mean, it was made very apparent to me where my last project with the security consulting company was with a big U.S. healthcare company, and I was wrapping up a project there, and they would make production changes once every 18 months. So when we would hand them as pen testers, a list of critical security issues, they'd say, thanks, we'll address those in 18 to 24 months. And I left there on a Friday and I started at Etsy on a Monday, and they sat me down and said, we make production deployments 20 times a day. We want you to figure out security. Go. And it was a really interesting opportunity. We had to try just tons of new things, the majority of which failed spectacularly, but a number of which actually really empowered us to move faster and really embrace DevOps and cloud as a result. And then part of that was really, we needed better ways to defend what became our main sources of risk, which were our web applications and our APIs and everything at the web layer. And the only thing that we had there at the time were the legacy web app firewall vendors, so the Akamai's, Imperva's, F5's, and we tried all of those, and the amount of architectural issues they introduced and the amount of false positives they introduced really were just so tremendous that we ended up building a fundamentally new approach there. And after a number of years at Etsy, we really saw that everyone was starting to face these same challenges. And so we stepped out from Etsy. My co-founders and I turned that into Signal Sciences and really turned that into a product there that our customers now use to defend everything from some of the most high traffic web applications in the world to incredibly small ones. We work with really large enterprise all the way down to smaller kind of security focused startups as well. So I've been really fortunate. I've gotten to kind of live on every side of the security industry throughout my career, and it's been something I've been very appreciative of.
That's awesome. Thanks for that. And you're obviously based in the US, but you've spent a bit of time down here in Australia recently. You've been on a bit of a speaker circuit and spending a bit more time down here, right? So what's your kind of plans in Australia?
Yeah, so we've definitely been seeing a fair amount of market traction in Australia, which, I mean, even just selfishly, I'm very excited about because I love coming to visit and get time there. On my last trip, it was right at the end of winter, so I would have loved for the timing for the weather to be a bit better. But other than that, we're seeing, like I said, quite a bit of expansion into Australia. It's a market that we're really excited about because we're seeing so many enterprises face the exact same challenges as to why we built Signal Sciences, which is that kind of digital transformation, that DevOps journey and that cloud journey. And that's why we built what we built, is to help defend those the applications in those environments.
Well, thanks again, Zane, for making the time available. And before we get into the conversation about security, and I'm sure you've seen this in the US right now, but Christmas trees are going up. It's that time of year. Melbourne's looking beautiful at the moment with Christmas trees and the lights going up. And it always is that point that gives you a bit of reflection on the year that we've come into the end of. And I was kind of reflecting yesterday that it feels like it's been a pretty rough year in the tech industry, where we started off the year with, all the crisis in Facebook and, Cambridge Analytica and suddenly technology influencing elections. We've had, Uber self-driving cars kill someone on the roads. We've had, China announcing their credit scoring, their social scoring system using AI. We've seen a lot of negative press around the tech industry this year in general. And do you guys agree, or am I just being a bit pessimistic? Am I a bit glass half full this week, do you think? What do you guys think?
I'll let Zane go first.
Oh, sure. I think there's, there's always plenty of negative news because, that kind of makes the headlines and the good news rarely does. I think we've also, at the same time, I think we've seen plenty of really exciting security research and kind of new products coming to market and new research coming out. But I would feel crazy if I didn't agree with you on that one, James. We have seen plenty of very negative stories this year.
Yeah, I'm just hoping that we can turn this around next year. It feels like there's a lot of, we're at the risk of losing kind of public confidence and support in the industry at the moment, which is quite scary when we think about the great ride the tech industry's been on for the last, decade at least, with amazing new products and amazing services, that suddenly it feels like we're in a bit of a low patch.
I tend to agree with Zane. There's no news like bad news. We've got the awesome Donald Trump, though, tweeting regularly about stuff. So that helps keep tech in the news for sure. But we're also seeing a lot of legislation changes over the last 12 months as well. We've had the introduction of mandatory data breach notification reporting in Australia. We've had the introduction of GDPR. we've had proposed legislation in the US, which is talking about effectively jailing executives where they don't meet, certain minimum standards for cybersecurity and whatnot. So we've got a lot of backdrop in that area as well. So, that's sort of stressing, I think, a lot of organizations out as well. And then you've also got the rise of cyber insurance as well. And I think everybody's sort of scrambling to go, well, do we just need to throw more money at this? And I was recently asked about, if you had infinite money, what would you spend it on? And I said, it's not about infinite money, because the digital ocean will literally swallow every dollar that you have and more. I think it's more around focusing on what is important for your business. And I think one of the issues that the security industry is facing at the moment is they've turned the concept of defense in depth into expense in depth. So effectively what you've got is you've got security teams that are just like, they don't even know what glass to look at. They're drowning in data. So people talk about data lakes. I talk about data swamps because we're up to our eyeballs in it. So anything that can reduce the signal to noise ratio for security teams is going to be a good thing. And I think that certainly, if you even look at what Verizon have been talking about over the last 10 years in their data breach reports, basics matter. So a lot of my colleagues in the industry are really going back to the 101 stuff, doing the hygiene and doing it really well. And a lot of them are actually forgoing a lot of the new cool toys. So it's going to be really interesting to see how AI plays out. 5 years ago, everything was next gen something. Now everybody's got an AI something. So I'd be keen to see what your perspective is in that, Zane.
Oh, I could not agree more with what you said. In fact, I had to mute myself a couple times there because I was laughing too hard in agreement, and I didn't want to laugh over it there. That's I think it's spot on, right? I think the macro trends here, right, are that the rate of technology adoption and kind of the velocity of new applications and new technologies entering the enterprise is increasing exponentially, right? It's not linear. It's increasing exponentially here. And I think the adoption of cloud, the adoption of DevOps, all of these, when you step back and actually look at them, they're about increasing velocity for the business. And so I think when you look at that and you look at the rate at which engineering teams are scaling to meet those challenges, and then how security teams are trying to scale to meet those challenges, you see where the problem comes in very fast, which is security teams can't hire fast enough to keep up, right? All of us as CISOs, we can have 1 million open headcount, and it doesn't matter because we can't fill it. And so the only way in which we actually scale our security programs is really via automation. And I think that's where AI and ML comes in. And I think one of the things you said, which I want to get out of the way first, is spot on, which is, everything used to be a next gen, then it was a APT, and now it's a AI, ML and all that. But putting aside like all the, RSA vendor booth marketing stuff, I think there actually are a few uses for AI and ML and where they come in from a practical perspective in a security program that I thought might be kind of interesting for us to talk about.
Yeah, and I mean, from my perspective, certainly one of the biggest threats that I see for our business is through automation. And unfortunately, you can't fight bots with humans. Bots need to fight bots at scale. And as you say, Zane, at velocity. And I think the days of writing rules to try and defend yourself against these things, it's just, you couldn't possibly do it. The commoditization of the tools that are used against us as well, and the marketplaces that exist. I mean, the barrier to entry has effectively collapsed. So as one of my engineers said the other day, when you give monkeys machine guns, they can do a lot of damage. And, and we see a lot, and a lot of the stuff that we see isn't super sophisticated. It's kind of like brute force and ignorance, but, it's effective.
Totally agree. I mean, I think that like you said, I think for many categories of attackers, the cost of attack has dropped to functionally zero. And so you can't, if you're dealing with any sort of security system where it's you manually writing rules or updating rules, it doesn't scale. And when I think about AI and ML and how how I tend to think about it as a CISO defending different organizations, it really kind of goes into two buckets for me. And I'm super curious your guys' thoughts on this. But for me, I think of it one way for kind of an enterprise CISO or a B2B CISO, where AI and ML to me means more about being able to automate certain response actions or certain investigative actions. So if I have a security operations team, or if I have, just technology folks in my team that moonlight as a security operations team, because I maybe am not at that scale or anything, I need technology that can automate a lot of their sort of response actions and things like that. So when some alert goes off, what are the first 5 steps that you always have to do manually? Let's really be able to throw machine learning at that or AI at that and really just say, look, here are actions that we take almost every time. Let's be able to automate that and look at that data set and see what info we need. And then the other side is kind of the B2C or consumer CISOs, where I think where AI and ML really comes in on that side predominantly. It comes in on the incident response side as well. But I think what's more unique to the consumer side is really about anti-abuse more than it is from security. It's more about kind of the spam and the abuse of consumer platforms that at consumer scale, you can't deal with manually. You have to be able to use AI and ML strategies to really combat that. But very, very curious your thoughts there.
Yeah, look, I would tend to agree. My view is that anything that gives my team the edge in terms of just sifting through the mountain of data they have is going to be a benefit. I totally agree with the view on, well, if you can do the same thing, if you have to do the same thing over and over again, that must be a candidate for automation. I view scaling my team, though, not just through technology, but actually through the engineering community within the organization itself. So effectively, I think one of the things that security teams need to do going forward is really to push out from this traditional command and control style type approach to effectively a more sort of aligned autonomy or a federated approach, where effectively you're pushing security out into the engineering teams and you're providing a set of services where they can leverage it at the point that best suits them, and you're effectively looking for the outcomes that they provide rather than putting in stage gates, which is typically what security do, and they come along and they just interrupt the flow and then everybody hates them. So
that's
it's more
exactly it.
So one of the things that I've done at REA is really to try and provide as far as we can a self-service model to go for a particular squad. Is kind of like, well, I don't care when you do the security testing, like you do it whenever it suits you, as long as you do it. But, my recommendation would be you do it probably sooner than later. But some squads may choose to do that. Some squads may not. But again, they're kind of making that choice and we effectively assess them on that basis. So in my view, technically speaking, I've got up to 450 people in my security team if I leverage the engineering community rather than the 8 people that I've actually got in the team. But we're a small company, a reasonably small sort of footprint, even though we're a large organization within Australia. So we've got to leverage what we can. And I think that the days of command and controls type security are finished, unless you're in a big bank or something like that where you have got 450 people in security and you can afford to do it. But I think that most businesses these days simply can't do that. So I think it's as much a human problem as it is a technical challenge as well.
Oh, completely agree. And I think even in the big bank example, right, they'll have 450 in security, but they'll have 20,000 in engineering, right? I think that security is going through this kind of existential shift or generational shift right now, where it's moving from functioning as a blocker inside organizations to where it has to function as an enabler. And I really think this is, it means that security, exactly as you said, we're not going to do it by just hiring more headcount in security. We have to really embed capability within the engineering teams. And that means giving them, tooling and techniques and all that, but also training them up and embedding security people there and turning, engineering, interested engineers into security people by extension there. And at the same time, this is really what, to me, is the line in the sand between a legacy security tooling and modern security tooling, which is that legacy security tooling was designed to only be used by very isolated, siloed security experts. And modern security tooling is designed to be used directly by development teams and DevOps teams and really empower them and plug into the systems and the tool chains that they're already using.
Flipping the conversation around a little bit, I mean, you guys would have dealt with, big investment in data and machine learning and different data practices within the organizations that you've worked in. What kind of new risks or threats does the rest of the company starting to use data and AI? What kind of risk does that introduce into your roles?
A lot of the challenges that I think people haven't really got to grips with is some of the inferred learnings that they get from various different data sets, especially when it comes to identifying individuals. So we know that personally identifiable information has got certain attributes, but you can actually infer identity based on things that aren't so explicit as well. So as we start joining all these data sets together, I think it's going to start getting a little bit hairy in terms of what really constitutes that personally identifiable information, because there's a whole lot of attributes that people are effectively they're self-disclosing through the use of their devices, their mobile phones, their watches. IoT is actually quite a hot topic in Australia at the moment in the security community as well. So you're just getting more and more data points, and it's sort of the collection aggregation of this. We just, I guess, aren't mature enough yet to understand what that truly means. And one data set in isolation may seem pretty innocuous, but as soon as you join into something else, that actually, those two data sets in of themselves start providing a bit of a profile on an individual. And I think that some organizations, many in fact, haven't really got to grips with what that really means. How are you finding it in the US, Zane?
I think you're spot on there. I think it's much more about privacy risks here, quite honestly, than it is about security risks. I think the security risks are about kind of bringing in the new technologies and everything that supports all of the data science, and those are fairly well understood, right? You're bringing in a new tech stack to an enterprise, and you think about, how do I defend this? How do I get visibility into it? How do I detect compromise? Things like that. I think the bigger, and it's easy to get focused on those. I think that the bigger kind of the strategic challenge as far as risk to an enterprise is really what you said, Craig. It's really that as we're bringing in more data and we're using it in new ways and different ways, and it's expanding across the enterprise in terms of who's even using data, right? It's kind of going from what historically was one very siloed team who would do things with a deep amount of data, and now it's really proliferating across the enterprise to where you can't be a cool team inside the company if you're not doing something with big data. And that really means that data is expanding across the organization. And it means that there's many new places for it to leak. There's many new places where you're kind of corroborating different sets of data, as you mentioned. And I think all of those really add up, in my mind, much more to privacy risk and how do we reduce that amount of data or get rid of the personally identifiable data to really make it safe. Those are really the risks I'm thinking about from that perspective, much less than the kind of security ones, which are still important, but are at least a bit more well understood because, from a security organization, you're used to new technologies coming into the enterprise, and you can kind of have a framework for thinking about that.
I actually think that there's something else that's not being talked about enough. All the legislation focuses on privacy, but the thing that really keeps me awake at night is corruption. So the integrity of the data, poisoning the well. We're increasingly using data to make decisions. You can't have a modern operation without a computer. You can't fly a plane without a computer. Critical infrastructure relies on computers to operate as well, and we're connecting all of these to the internet. So it doesn't take too much of a stretch to go, well, if I can actually corrupt that data, and when I say corrupt, I don't mean damage. I actually mean inject something else into it to influence a different outcome. That's the thing that sways elections. That's the thing that actually can poison the water system of an entire city. And you just got to look at stuff that happened in Ukraine over the last couple of years with it was either dark energy or black energy. I can't remember. Maybe Zane, off the top of your head, the malware that was released that disrupted the energy grid, and that took people went dark on that, and that's the thing that's really bothering me as we increasingly use technology not to assist us, but actually we're becoming reliant upon it. I mean, be keen on your thoughts and observations on that?
Yeah, no, I think data corruption is one of those that has worried a lot of us for a very long time, and it is one that thankfully we haven't seen. I'd say we've certainly seen some of, but I don't think we've seen nearly as much as we all worried might exist. I mean, I say it half in jest, but half not. I still think the most terrifying malware that would ever happen is the malware that goes through your enterprise, finds all of the spreadsheets, and changes a random cell to a random value in every spreadsheet. Right, right. That shuts down whole industries overnight, and it's half in jest but half not. Right. I think that data corruption is a very scary thing that thankfully we've mostly seen. I say thankfully to a certain degree of thankfully. We've mostly seen when attacks do corruption, it's kind of one end of the spectrum or the other, where they don't do anything about it at all, or they completely shut off the lights. I think the scary one is much more that kind of in-between state, and that where you can no longer trust any of your data set. That gets really scary across the board.
And I actually think it's that element of human trust that is potentially one of the I'd say it's a threat, or it's an emerging risk, for want of a better word, because
sure.
If people don't trust the machine, then that's where the whole thing breaks down. I think there was a few years ago, I don't know, it was Dow Jones or the NASDAQ, they actually had some AI or some automation in terms of making buying and selling decisions, and it was using hundreds and hundreds of data points, whereas traditionally the analysts were maybe using, upwards on maybe 6 or 7 data points to make a decision. And they simply lost. They decided they didn't trust the machines to make those decisions, because it's kind of like a lot of them are going on intuition and experience and so on. And I think once you lose the trust in a system, then people will effectively stop using it.
No disagreement there.
Yeah, I was on that corruption point. I was kind of doing a bit of reading ahead of this, and I came across one of these examples of adversarial attacks, which were quite intriguing in terms of the potential impact and just the way that those attacks come about, and being able to effectively change something that the human eye can't see in the physical world, like in an image or in the physical world, and forcing something to happen then quite significant, like forcing a driverless car, for example, to not see a stop sign anymore. Can you guys talk a little bit more about that? Because I kind of read that example and it frightened the hell out of me. I'm kind of interested to hear your perspectives on how real a threat those kind of things are.
There's a famous, I don't know, Zane, if you've seen the XKCD cartoon, where you've got the stick guy on the left-hand side saying, hey, it's okay, we've secured this data with RSA 4096 encryption. On the right-hand side, the stick guy is saying, I'll hit him over the head with his $5 wrench. He tells me his password.
Exactly.
Right?
It's one of my favorites.
for as clever as we think we are designing the machines, it never ceases to amaze me how the most mundane thing literally drives a bus straight through it.
It's funny. I was... literally, this seems like a made-up story for a podcast, and yet this actually happened to me a couple hours ago. Earlier today, I was looking at Twitter, and someone happened to retweet something that I thought was just absolutely perfect for our conversation today, which was a reporter making a joke about, like how everyone's worried about these highly complex, kind of deep fake AI attacks on folks, and then published a screenshot of how one of their friends had just done a right click on a news story they had published and just edited the HTML to make the headline say something dumb, and then took a screenshot of it and published that. And then they had been getting flack all day because people had thought they had published that thing that someone had just, faked by editing 2 lines of HTML over. But I think it goes really well to the XKCD example there, that, those attacks are absolutely real. And, they are definitely things for us to think about. At the same time, attackers are people too, right? And they're lazy. Why go through a highly complex attack scenario when you can edit a few lines of HTML and fake a screenshot, or when, you hit someone with a wrench for their password rather than trying to break the encryption? So I think the important kind of the amusing story aside, I think the real takeaway for us as practitioners and technology leaders and security leaders is, there's a lot of times there's a tendency to focus on the very shiny new attack. And this is going back to something that Craig said in the beginning that I completely agree with. It's not wrong to think about the new attacks and to really be, having a framework in mind for them and thinking about, what's the tipping point for when you need to focus a lot of resources to them. But really, in the meantime, we need to be spending a lot of time on basics as well, right? I think one of the big success criteria for a CISO is really if you can force your adversaries to have to use these advanced attacks. I think that that's a tremendous mark of success for a security program is, do the basics not work against your organization and they have to do these complex attacks?
Yeah, and I think it's table stakes really now in terms of, I always describe our security program as it's an economics game effectively, and economics always wins. And there's the cost of an attack versus the cost of defense, and unfortunately, the two are completely at odds. The cost of attack is actually decreasing exponentially over time, while the cost to defend is increasing exponentially. And the only thing that gives me sort of faith with the AI stuff is that might give me an economic edge. It may, let's say, increase the cost of an attack to an economic level, which makes it just not worth somebody's while to come after me, and they'll go after somebody else. It's the old, I don't have to be the fastest antelope, but just got to not be the slowest. But anything that we can do to help change the economics, I think is going to be an advantage. But I worry that people are still getting the checkbooks out and they're just saying, how much do you need? And that does deeply bother me.
So there's a question of these big ticket kind of new emerging security risks like an adversarial attack are great for getting people to part with money or invest cash in products, when in reality, the thing that's most likely to cause a problem in your organization is something far more basic with a low cost of attack.
Well, take DMARC, for example, right? Doesn't cost anything to do that. It's configuration. It's highly effective. Yet there are many, many products out there that are trying to assess emails when we've already got some basic hygiene that we could do to effectively broadcast to Microsoft and Google and Yahoo and whatnot the legitimacy of the emails that we send out. So I think a lot of people have kind of almost lost some of those basic skills.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think, if you go stand in the middle of Silicon Valley and say adversarial attack 3 times fast, a term sheet magically appears for a series but I don't think it's the same thing if you say email configuration. I don't think that one works.
No. And actually, I know a CISO friend of mine used to say to me over coffee, says, you know what, I can't get my team out of bed in the morning unless it involves reverse engineering advanced malware.
Yeah.
It's like nobody jumped out of bed in the morning to say, you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to patch 50 servers and I'm going to love it. but yet we know patching servers, as boring as it is super effective.
Yeah. Oh, that's one of the most effective. At the same time, I think we're speaking from kind of the practical CISO lens. The other side of it, though, that I think is important, I don't want folks to leave kind of discounting these sort of attacks or anything there, is we're at such an infancy of the usage of AI and ML and thinking about the risks and about the attacks against them that now actually is, I think there is a lot of value in, publicizing research on some of these so that we're at such an early stage that we've got the opportunity to actually get it right, rather than everything has been widely adopted and now we discover a crippling attack against it and then everyone tries to react after that. I think there certainly is value. I think the thing that we tend to focus on from, putting our CISO hats on is what's affecting our organizations today and for the next several years, but looking out kind of across the broader industry and, 5-10 years out, these sort of things are certainly important to think about.
I certainly agree that I think it is in its infancy. In fact, I spent a morning with university professor from Deakin here in Melbourne a while ago, and he's been in this field for 20 years, back when it was called expert systems and whatnot. And it was a little bit depressing actually to hear him talk about the advances in AI, and if what he's telling me is true, we're kind of in the Stone Age still. So whenever Stephen Hawking and Elon and all of these guys are coming saying AI is going to annihilate the human race, and I'm thinking, yeah, we're way off from that yet, I think.
had a very funny conversation. That we're at a panel event the other night, and there's a data scientist who I know who was talking about making the same point. And she works in natural language processing, and she said, you just need to remember that there's the most advanced computer in the world right now can't understand the word "it" properly because of its various connotations. So don't worry too much about the robot overlords quite yet. We've got a long way to go.
Yeah, I think so.
So, obviously a lot of our audience are kind of, business leaders who are taking their first step on the road towards using AI, ML in their business. So if, what's the kind of 2 or 3 bits of advice you'd give to people who are starting to dip their toe in the water with AI and ML around security? What are the kind of big questions they should be asking?
Sure. I'd say the biggest one that really jumps to mind there is kind of something we talked a little bit about before, but reframing it a bit here is to think about as you're collecting all of the data to make this possible, be thinking about if that's really data that you want to hold on to or if that's a data that you actually need across there. I think that both the new compliance regimes coming in of GDPR and those in Australia and probably those in the US at some point whenever we get around to those. I think that's really going to introduce a lot of compliance side of things to think about. But I think really from just a pure privacy perspective and not keeping data that you don't need, ultimately putting you in a better position than sticking around a bunch of data so that when a breach inevitably does happen, now you have all of this on your hands. I would really be thinking from a perspective of privacy, from a perspective of what are the business goals that I'm actually trying to accomplish with AI, with ML, and what's really the minimum amount of data I need to actually accomplish those goals so I'm not taking on all of this additional risk for ultimately no reason. I think that's really my top one off the top of my head. And I'm curious your perspective here, Craig.
I mean, it's interesting that point as well because, the message out there in vendor land right now is storage is cheap, compute is cheap. It's never been faster or cheaper to, build a data lake, throw everything in one place and extract kind of insight from it. So
if you only look at certain costs there, right? Is just storage cheap? Yes. Is a violating GDPR cheap and breaking, fining 4% of your global revenue? That's not so cheap, right? And so it's, I think, really looking at this strategically rather than the actual sticker price of specific components, but looking at it overall and holistically, that's where there's real costs and real trade-offs to actually manage.
Actually considering the regulatory cost of that data being breached in some way needs to be part of that kind of financial analysis.
Certainly.
For me, I think not dissimilar to Zane, but I'd be thinking about your use case. So why do you think you need this? What problem are you trying to solve that you can't currently solve today? And is this going to truly give you the edge? Because enterprise systems are diverse and they contain messy data. So, what I've seen is some products that work fine in the lab, you throw them into the enterprise and all of a sudden, you're getting false positives and your engineering teams are pulling their hair out. I know quite a lot of my colleagues who have experimented with this have had limited results. That's not to say there's some good stuff out there, and certainly in the anti-bot mitigation arena, there's a lot of good work being done. Some of the stuff on the endpoint as well, showing promise. But still, it's not magic pixie dust. So you can't just pull out the old AI unicorn and, all your problems will be solved. So I think it's really being very mindful about, what problem are you going to solve? What is your use case? And I think also have in your mind what success looks like. So how would you know? Just because you've bought the thing, turn on the blinky lights, is it actually providing you with a tangible benefit?
Definitely.
One of the other topics that's come up, you guys just touched on GDPR and regulation a little bit as well. And our first guest on the podcast was a lady, Ellen Broad, and she pointed out in her book that GDPR introduces the right for European citizens to opt out of automated decision-making systems and to actually force, or they have the right to request explanation for how decisions have been made. And in some ways, I guess that's nothing hugely new. I mean, credit scoring's been around for a long time, and most countries offer a legal protection for citizens to be able to request a copy of their credit score and correct it if they think something's wrong. But I was kind of intrigued, and I was quite surprised that GDPR went to that depth to say, citizens, you can opt out of an automated decision, or you can request to understand how that decision's been made. That seems really forward thinking. Do you guys agree? Do you think that kind of legislation will make its way to Australia and the US, and do you think that's going to be enforceable as well?
I actually think that the legislation may be actually unenforceable because you may not know, and people may not actually atomically be able to find out in the future how certain decisions are made, because there's data points coming from somewhere in different places, especially if the algorithms start becoming self-learning as well. So I'd be really interested to see if you can really test that in anger. I know what your thoughts are, Zane. Yeah,
no, I certainly don't disagree with that. And I think with GDPR specifically, and with any of the new compliance regimes coming in, it's going to be the next 10 years of challenges to those and case law actually being established around those and everything before we find out what they end up looking like in practice. I think we're in this big kind of gray area right now where, with GDPR specifically, I mean, it was written to allow the European countries to go after Facebook, Google, and Amazon, right? And so they'll do that, but then where it starts to actually apply to other businesses is when they finally try to apply GDPR to just a random other business and see how it actually takes shape in practice.
The challenge with regulation, though, I don't know what your thoughts on this is, saying, but regulation is usually a lagging control anyway. In my view, technology is always way further on than people's brains are, and then regulation lags that again. So it's almost like we're like it's a capability curve. So there's things that are going on tech today that the legislation just did not imagine. People are dreaming up uses for in a way that people never envisaged, and then to try and shoehorn and retrofit legislation to take that into account, it's going to be problematic. And as you say, a lot of this will be tested out in the courts and so on. But I think the Australian legislation isn't a million miles away from GDPR anyway. It'd be interesting to see how it pans out in the future.
One of the interesting things with that GDPR point around automated decisioning as well was you're kind of excluded from that option if the data being used is considered public data, which I thought was kind of interesting because that's a broad definition. I mean, how do we define kind of public data in this day and age? And just because you put something on Facebook, does that mean that you think you're allowing that to be used to make an important decision about you? So I'm going to be very interested to your point to see how that actually plays out in a court over time.
Well, especially to bring we haven't even talked about ethics at all in automated decision making either. And actually, I think it was Amazon in the last 2 weeks has just shut down an AI capability they had to assess resumes because apparently it was biased against women, which presumably was one of the reasons that potentially they put it in to try and remove bias from the recruitment process. So, humans program machine learning, they build the models. So there's obviously some sort of bias that's crept in there at some point. So, that's going to be a whole messy problem in and of itself.
Yeah, we were talking about a great book on this topic recently, Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks, which is a book written out of the US, which opened my eyes because I hadn't realised just how prevalent the use of automated decisioning was, certainly in the US in the public service and in areas like welfare and education and justice. I think even going back to 2014, there was, 24 states in the US were using kind of automated recidivism models to make recommendations on resentencing versus parole. And obviously we saw the ProPublica case that exposed kind of the bias in those kind of algorithms. So a really interesting kind of book around automation in the public space. And generally, I think we tend to say in Australia, well, that's probably not going to come here or that won't happen here. But, we've already seen some kind of early signs of that, which, I think is a really hot topic that probably a lot of people aren't aware of.
Well, we saw that with Centrelink earlier on this year where decisions were being made programmatically and people were having various benefits changed or withdrawn or whatnot, and people quite rightly lost their minds over that sort of thing, and there's a bit of a climb down. So it's already happening, certainly in Australia. If you look over in China, they're looking at holding low-level court cases, basically online in WeChat, where you've got like a three-way conversation between, you know, the defendant, their lawyer, and a judge, and they're sort of presiding over that. I mean, it's not really too far a stretch to say, well, for certain activities, you would have some sort of automated penalty decision making via a bot from even a legal cost saving point of view.
Well, you can fight your parking ticket online now, can't you, with a bot?
Well, you can argue until the cows come home, but I don't know whether they're going to overturn it.
Yeah.
What's the correct emoji for you've been sentenced to life in prison there? I think that the real hard-hitting questions.
Well, we've been asking all our guests on this one. It doesn't really apply to you, Zane, but we've had a conversation with all our guests who are based here in Australia around opting out of the medical health record scheme. So there's a big a new medical health scheme, digital medical health scheme here in Australia, Zane, and the government's kind of giving people the right to opt out.
Interesting.
And it's I think pretty much every guest we've had so far on the show who's Australian has opted out. Craig, you open to share your answer on this one?
Yeah, I opted out too. Yeah. Look, governments the world over, I'm not going to single out Australia. Governments don't tend to have a good track record in enterprise technology projects. Pretty much, they're generally cataclysmic disasters. When you have ministers coming out making statements such as, well, it's probably one of the most secure systems in the world, you know that's just a kiss of death. I mean, Singapore, which has a very similar system up and running, has already had a compromise on that. So it's like, well, I've done some business with Singaporeans, and they're pretty studious, and they know what they're doing. And so if Singapore's got a problem, then I wouldn't hold out too much hope for some of the other countries.
I was talking to someone from the medical profession about this the other night, and they said, well, often a patient will arrive in ER unable to communicate and with no one else with them. And, you're calling around trying to get hold of medical records, and this is going to make a big difference. And I guess for that example, I
get the use case. I totally agree. And thankfully, touch wood, myself and my family are fit and healthy today. If that changed and I was on some sort of a regime or whatnot, then the risk versus reward sort of thing the scales might tip. I'll tell you what, the one thing that I was going to opt in. The one thing that actually pulled me out of that was when I found out about the level of access that third-party apps were going to have to the data. Right. As soon as I heard third-party apps, I went, that's it, I'm out. Because there's just something weird. When we look at Cambridge Analytica with Facebook, third-party integrations is a disaster area, frankly. The level of access and the data and the governance over what they have access to is pretty poor in general. So that bothered me greatly, and that was a thing that tipped me over the edge in terms of going, no, actually, I'm not going to do this. I'll sit back and I can always opt in.
Yeah.
I think that's the frustrating thing with all of these things, right? Is the value proposition is fairly clear and understandable and sounds, actually quite valuable. It's the implementation that is so terrifying to everyone.
And nobody would dispute the benefits here, and I 100% believe in the benefits. And to your point earlier, James, about if you come into hospital and you're uncommunicative and you're maybe allergic to penicillin or some other drug or whatever, that could be the difference between life and death. But as Zane points out, generally speaking, it's the implementation. It's like cryptography, for example. The maths works. It's always the implementation of the math that lets us down.
Exactly.
Last couple of questions from me for you guys. Probably first one for you, Craig. We've talked a lot on the show so far around how kind of vibrant the AI ML community is around Australia. Great meetups, events, blogs, content out there. Just in your space in security, similar kind of community, you guys active in it AI and ML? Is it a common conversation in that community?
So first of all, from a community point of view, absolutely, the cyber security community in Australia is booming. It's buzzing. There is a lot of interaction between myself and my colleagues. A broad spectrum. I mean, you just look at the amount of meetups and conferences and sort of community groups that are getting together, self-organizing as well. We get a lot of great support from our businesses and our enterprises, and also the vendor community too. So absolutely, is AI featuring in it? More and more. I think predominantly the AI conversations coming out of vendor land, rather than my colleagues saying, you know what, I really need some machine learning, like nobody ever said to me ever. But sorry, Zane.
No, I'm with you.
I think we've been the next gen wave just really ruined it for everybody. So we're a little bit more, security people are cynical anyway. If you see something in the Gartner Magic Quadrant enough times, you're definitely not going to pay it any attention, contrary to popular belief. Well, certainly my colleagues won't. I can't vouch for my peers who probably read the magazine on the plane and go, hey, Craig, I saw this thing. Should we invest in it? It's like, not so much.
But it sounds like the conversation in the community from an AI point of view is more, how can we apply it in our own domain, rather than I'm worried about my business using AI and ML at the moment. Sounds like from your perspective, it's more, how can we use the tools as security professionals, rather than, oh my God, there's a whole big problem we've got to defend against.
Yeah, I think the AI thing is more around a conversation about automation rather than artificial intelligence or machine learning, to be honest with you. Yeah. So sort of bad bots and automation attacks, credential stuffing, that type of stuff is definitely front of mind. We are seeing constant probing using commodity-based tools that leverage the same technology that we use to build our businesses. So elastic computing, very cheap storage, sort of the things that build our businesses are also being used against us. So that's probably what the conversation is more going about. A lot of conversation about IoT though. Certainly within Australia, and I guess it's just being driven through critical infrastructure conversations and whatnot, especially as we start plumbing, our electricity meters into the.
And you kind of, I think when we've spoken before, you've talked about how a lot of those IoT devices aren't really designed with security in mind, or you've never been that whole technology landscape not really being built with security in mind.
Yeah, I mean, Mirai is a good example of a botnet that was leveraging IoT devices with default passwords, and they're coming out of the factory like this. So all of a sudden, it just goes exponential in terms of the amount of things that can be leveraged against you. So that's definitely a conversation that's happening within security. But unfortunately, until you go into the supply chain and fix that, you can't patch these things, and they're built very cheaply. And exported all over the world. So that problem's going to persist for a long time.
And Zane, you've been involved in a couple of the Aussie community events, I think, over the last few months. Any highlights for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of how AI and ML enters the conversation, I think, Craig, you were spot on there. I think how we all as CISOs tend to hear those, phrases come up to us is some vendor trying to pitch us something with that. I think how we tend to talk about it amongst our peers is much more through the lens of automation. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning, in that the only way we're able to keep up from a security perspective with the scale that's going on is being able to automate and using different techniques and tools to empower that. I think from the last few trips I've been able to make to Australia and really talking with the community there, I think it's been really exciting for me seeing kind of the adoption going on there and the real leaning into the journey around DevOps and around cloud and kind of embracing these new technologies. I've certainly spent plenty of time in other locations where outside of Australia, where folks tend to try to push off those new approaches. And something that's always really deeply impressed me about Australia is how many conversations I've had with completely different folks in completely different industries that are all really thinking about how can we better adopt new technology? How can we be really embracing cloud and DevOps and AI and ML. And it's something that's been both really impressive and really exciting.
Awesome. Well, guys, it's been great having you guide me through this conversation around security. Thank you for making the time available, and we'll talk to you both again soon.
Thanks very much, James.
Absolutely. Thanks for doing it, James.
Thanks, Zane. See you, mate.
Thanks for joining us on AI Australia. We hope you got a lot out of it. If you enjoyed the show, feel free to leave us a review on iTunes by searching for AI Australia and giving us your honest feedback. It goes a long way to boost our visibility when you do that, so we really appreciate it. As always, we'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, head to eliiza.com.au/contact and drop us a note. Thanks again, and look forward to seeing you next week.